We are so blessed to have Evie as a leader amongst us. Reneen is also one that leads in this area, but they have this special gifting of putting broken things back together and helping people to find wholeness. We've got others as well, and I love that part of our church life if you haven't connected with it yet. Good morning. If we haven't met, my name's Elizabeth, and I'm so glad you're here with us today. I am concluding our series called Temple, which surprisingly is about the beginning of Genesis, but hopefully that will make more sense as we get into the message this morning. But first, I would like to talk about kids and eating, okay? Now, many of you may be parents. All of you have been kids. And I wonder what your memories are about what you wanted to eat as a kid, what your parents wanted you to eat, or what your kids wanted to eat and what you wanted them to eat. Well, in our house, there is nobody who has a stronger will about these things than the young man that is sitting in the front row, who I will definitely owe coffee later. But this guy, as a 2-year-old, he could not be bribed. He could not be bought if we wanted him to do things a different way. He would die on the hill that he decided to die on. And so we've had food battles at different times, but the most epic food battle happened on what we thought was an ordinary weeknight. We were having salmon and vegetables, which my kids generally like, and he had liked before. You ever had that with your kids? Like, you liked this 2 weeks ago, but not this night. He didn't like salmon and vegetables on this night, and he was 2 or under. He was a little guy. But I will just point out that I think it's possible that he got some of this strength and determination from his dad, definitely from me too, but the reason that I think this is because Rick was not having it. Like, I would probably cut my losses and say, be hungry. But Rick and Gabe just stared at each other at the table, okay? Rick tried the age-old fallbacks of like the train and the airplane, not having it. There was like bribing, if you eat it, you can have ice cream, not having it. So Rick kind of forced it in his mouth. Now, this is not a parenting skills talk. This is an illustration. Not recommending that you copy us. This is just a story about something that happened in our family. So Rick gets the food in his mouth, and it seems that Rick has won. But no, the battle is just beginning. This kid held half-digested salmon and vegetables in his mouth for 2 full hours. You can put it in my mouth, but you cannot make me swallow it. Until he fell asleep, still holding the food, and Rick was left defeated to stick his finger in his mouth, scoop out half-chewed food, and say, I lost the battle, but I'm going to win the war. And I'm happy to report that just the other day, Gabriel really enjoyed a dinner of salmon and vegetables. So, eventually he learned to eat more healthy. But what is my point in all of this? And what does it have to do with Genesis chapter 2? Well, most of us understand that food is very connected to our health. That's not really a shocking pronouncement in this day and age. Parents care what their kids eat. We may not always win the battle, but we care, and we want them to put nutritious food in their mouths. Parents, do you want your kids to eat nutritious food, not live on Red Bulls and donuts, things like that? Okay. And if you don't have kids, I think you probably generally understand that what you put in your mouth is tied to how you feel, your thriving, your health. If you don't know that, you can talk to Beth, our nurse practitioner, and she could affirm the truth of this statement. We have the real food movement like we talked about last week. We understand that food has real consequences. Can you indulge me in a quick parable or metaphor? Can you imagine that your child, your grandchild, a child that you love, you find out that they are being taught that food doesn't matter. So the message is this: what you put in your mouth, that's just up to you. You should eat to whatever makes you happy in the moment. Food is private. No one really should tell you what to do about that. What you do in the privacy of your own home, that's just for you. You may like Brussels sprouts, but you can't put that preference on me or tell me that they're good for me if I think donuts are better for me. So they're just being taught all the time. It doesn't matter what you eat. Food doesn't have any real consequences in your life. And then this child, predictably, given total free reign on food, wants to live on French fries and gummy bears, okay? You give no direction. So that's what they want to eat every meal. But then the sad thing is that kid would not be able to thrive and be healthy, but they wouldn't understand why. And the thing is, all of us get that. And I think in our wider culture, people understand. We're not being prudish. Food matters. And you pay the consequences if you ignore your body. And we teach our kids that way. But we have so little language for connecting sex to reality. I warned you we were going there today. We just don't know how to talk about sex as being something that really affects our thriving, affects our lives, affects our emotions and our bodies. But God says in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, as we've been unpacking, that he made us for relationships that were good, and he made us for sex that's meant to be good and be a gift if we're in marriage. And so it has real consequences in the real world, and we ignore that at our own peril. We ignore how real this good gift of creation, bodies, relationships, sex is, that it came from God and he gives it purpose. When we ignore that, we are the ones that pay the consequences. And we suffer. People suffer. So that's what I want to unpack today as we look at Genesis chapter 2. Because if we believe the Bible, then we believe that sex and our bodies are deeply good gifts from God, but also that he gives them purpose. So let's read Genesis chapter 2. And here we go. Genesis chapter 2. Then the Lord God said, "It's not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper who is just right for him." So the Lord formed from the ground all the wild animals and all the birds of the sky. He brought them to the man to see what he would call them, and the man chose a name for each one. He gave names to all the livestock, all the birds of the sky, and all the wild animals. But still, there was no helper just right for him. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. While the man slept, the Lord God took out one of the man's ribs and closed up the opening. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib, and he brought her to the man. At last, the man exclaimed, "This one is bone from my bone and flesh from my flesh. She will be called woman because she was taken from man." This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Now the man and his wife were both naked, but they felt no shame. All right. So humans, it's right there. That's exactly what we're talking about. Humans were made for God-designed embodied relationships. And because this is the first relationship described, it's not just marriage that's in view, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. That relationship was a marriage, but it's also just about human relationship. We were made for relationship with other people. And we need it. The Bible's clear that we need it because community is good. It's not good to be alone. So we've talked quite a bit as we're going through this temple series about how Genesis has a very poetic and artistic tone to it. And there's a lot of repeated phrases. And one of those phrases is, "It was good." We heard, "It was good." We went through Genesis 1 pretty slowly, and we heard, "It was good," over and over again. For those of you who didn't hear those messages, we talked about how the picture the author paints is of God building a temple in which there'd be worship, in which he would be able to have relationship and fellowship with people. And all of it had shalom, just like Evie was talking about this morning. There was wholeness, there was peace, there was goodness. So the first time we hear that anything is not good is in this passage. It is not good that man is alone. And that's meant to be like, let's say you're just hearing a melodic soundtrack to your favorite movie, and then we were watching a show last night, and the music changed and we were all like, something bad's going to happen, right? So it's just that discord that causes us to recognize this is the first thing that's not good in all of creation. It's not good for man to be alone. And this, of course, is not just about marriage, but it's about human community. So God the man has unhindered relationship with God. He has all the animals, and still it's not good. I had to pause and think about this for a moment. Is he really alone? And also, if you had the opportunity to just have some time that was just unhindered relationship with God and beautiful nature and animals, would you take that in a heartbeat on some days and just leave the people behind? But ultimately, it's not good. We are created, even though God is everything, he created us to need relationships with one another. And that is a clear point of this passage. It's not good for us to be alone. Loneliness is considered to be one of the rising health crises in the United States. I found some pretty amazing information as I was studying that. I knew some of it, but I want to give you this one. Social isolation, one study found, is as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. We all know that's bad. But not having human connection is incredibly bad for our souls. I was very shocked to find out that loneliness increases the risk of premature death by 50%, and also that the loneliest age group is age 18 to 22. That was pretty shocking to me. But another age group that has very high levels of loneliness are senior citizens. And so what that points me to is this, that the Bible is, again, proved accurate as we look at the science, and that we need each other. Even generationally, we need each other. We've got lonely young people and lonely old people. We need each other. We need community. So Genesis also talks very specifically about the marriage relationship, and I want to just spend a moment talking about this because there's a whole lot of baggage associated with this passage that I hope to just kind of clear away some of maybe what you've heard before, if we can be clear about what the passage says and what it doesn't say. So this probably, hope some of you this may be brand new to, and I'm glad. Those of you who've grown up in church, you might have heard the word help me from the King James Version. God created a help me. Well, in here it says helper, and the Hebrew word is ezer kenegado. I'm sure I'm probably not saying it right, but that's approximately it. And it is the accurate words. It's just not maybe the accurate pronunciation. So I want to talk to you first about this word ezer, translated helper. So there's just a really big misnomer around this word because the Bible does say helper, but it does not say secretary, personal assistant. It doesn't say cook or housekeeper or anything like that. In fact, if you trace the use of the word ezer through the Old Testament, the most common one described as an ezer or helper is God, Yahweh. He is your helper. The other common use of the word ezer is for a king bringing an army. So you are in a position where your army doesn't have what it takes at that moment, and you need a partner. And this ally king comes in with a strong army, and he is your ezer, your helper. And so it's really incorrect to understand that when God says he makes a helper for Adam, that this is somebody who is positioned underneath him. Everything about the passage says that she's created in strength and coming alongside. Kenegado means opposite to, in front of, or next to, the idea being that they're the same and different. So Adam probably didn't know he was male until there was Eve. It was like, oh, I see how we're the same and how we're different. That's the idea of Kenegado. But here's what I want you to notice. There is absolutely no view of hierarchy here. Everything in this passage points to mutuality. That's where the story starts. Next, it says she was made out of his rib. Also a really beautiful picture because there's interdependence in view. Woman came out of man, but every man since then came out of a woman. Am I right? So there's interdependence there. And secondly, she's not his head, she's not at his feet, she's at his heart. She's his peer. There's intimacy and mutuality right there. I think this is so incredibly important that we grasp this, because there is a whole school of thought that believes that men and women were created like this. And what happens in Genesis chapter 3 is that sin disrupts the shalom. And we begin to see all the archies, hierarchy, patriarchy, et cetera, but it's really different to understand that, yes, that's how the world is, rather than believing that's the way God intended it to be. So the beginning of the story is mutuality, complementing, intimacy, right here, man and woman. Now I want to acknowledge the obvious truth that almost no marriage really lives up to this ideal. But I hope we can just take hope in the fact that that's the way that God intends it to be. That God did not create us to battle for who's in charge. He created us to complement each other and to work together. But the passage also has some very specific things to say about sex. So let's go there. It says that sex is good. And I want to point out, I want to bring out three things that make sex good. And no, this is going to stay PG. But I want to point out three things that come from St. Augustine. Okay, so you can take a breath and relax. He was the first to say this is how you describe and how you know if sex is good. The first is faithful. It's faithful, fruitful, relational. Faithful. So I think this is probably the most obvious one. Sex is supposed to be about two people being committed to each other in their whole lives, not just in the bedroom. So I had a Bible college professor who said repeatedly, sex starts with taking out the trash. Sex starts with doing the dishes. So now you understand why Rick doesn't want you to take out the trash in our house. If you come to visit us, he wants to do it himself, right? And why Elijah he says if he's doing the dishes, just don't call him later. But what I'm trying to say here is we have to serve each other. We serve each other. And our lives are committed to each other. And in hookup culture, it's almost impossible for sex not to become a commodity, where it's a marketplace, where you're trying to be picked or to pick, and it's something that's bought and sold. And only marriage is strong enough to allow our souls to be safe from being bought and sold. I'm going to say that again. Only marriage is a strong enough framework to keep us from being bought and sold, to keep sex from becoming a commodity. That's why faithfulness matters so much. So we can be safe to be vulnerable. Secondly, fruitful. Okay, so the obvious thing that's in view here is God tells them to multiply, to have children. But I don't think that can be the only thing that's in view. If that's the case, then Kevin and Evie are winning the marriage game with 5 children, okay? Then that might be true. But I think we can think bigger, because there are lots of couples who can't have children, or they choose not to have children for really good reasons. And there are other ways that a marriage can be fruitful and generative in the world. So let's say a marriage where there's a really healthy union allows for this man and woman to build an amazing business, or one of them to build that and the other to support them. And it's a blessing to the community, or to write a book, or to plant a garden, or to care for children. But when your marriage is good, it allows you to be somebody who can be fruitful in the world. And so when a union is good, it is fruitful. And then thirdly, it's relational. Now, obviously with each other, it's relational, but here's the thing. It's also, Augustine said that when sex is good, it brings both spouses closer to God. And what that means, I think, is this. If you haven't noticed yet, we disappoint each other. If you haven't noticed yet in marriage, probably now that you're married, and for some of us it's been a long time, surprise, not all of your desires are met, and your spouse is not able to know you and love you and read your mind perfectly all the time, and that can be really disappointing. Loneliness in marriage is harder than loneliness when you're single. But what that does when you know God is to point you to Him. And here's the thing, sex cannot bear the burden of idolatry. So if you expect your sexual relationship, your love relationship, your romantic relationship to fulfill all your needs, if you expect that person to be able to meet all your desires, then it's going to fall apart. But when it's good, it's transparent. And both of you are pointed towards God. So you take the places where it hurts. You take the places where you miss each other, and you turn that towards God. And that is what it means to have it be relational. And it does turn us towards where we're going to land this plane this morning, which is about recovering what is broken. In the next passage, Genesis chapter 3, which we don't have time to read this morning, sin comes into the world. And so things go sideways. Good sex goes bad. Good friendships go bad. Families misunderstand each other and break apart. And that is the reality also of the world we live in. It's not God's intention, but it is reality. And so, what do we do? What do we do when that temple, that shalom that God built, that we find cracks in our lives, in our relationships? That's where the grace of Jesus comes in. That's where the gospel comes in. And that's where I want to end this morning. Throughout this series, we've been learning about this temple. And Paul actually talks again about this idea of temple in Ephesians chapter 2, and I hope you can hear it in a different way, a fresh way. This is Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14. He himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one. He has destroyed the barrier dividing the wall of hostility. Okay, Paul is describing the Jewish temple and using it as a metaphor in this passage. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who were far away and peace to those who were near. For through him, we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple to the Lord. So the wall of hostility, the temple was built in such a way that different people could come into different spaces. First and foremost, the idea was that the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people, had to stay out. And so that wall became a division, us versus them. And Paul is dealing with that. But there was another wall from which women could not pass. And there was one where only priests could pass because the way wasn't opened up yet. But what Paul's saying is because of Jesus' death on the cross, we are all invited into the Holy of Holies. We are all invited into relationship face-to-face with God. But what does that mean about our relationships in this temple? Well, if we're going to get our vertical relationship right with God, we're going to have to deal with our horizontal relationships. Because we can't draw close to God and encounter him without encountering each other. And the ground is level at the foot of the cross. So on a practical level, this week started off with a bang for me, okay? I called someone, another believer, and not someone from our church, and I wanted to apologize for a logistical thing that had happened. And that person read me the riot act. And I really was kind of done. Like, I feel like I have bent over backwards. I have a right to pull back and be resentful. And you know what I was doing right after that? Studying this passage about how I can't avoid making relationships right with other people. as I myself receive grace from the Lord for my own sin. I'm married, so I had the opportunity to be resentful towards my spouse this week too. How about you? Did you have the opportunity to deal with that? And it is so much easier to see things my way, to just be good with God, but not with this other person that I live with. I'll tell you what else is easy: to judge other people's sexual sins and not look at the way that I don't live up to loving my spouse. Any sexual relationship that is not faithful, fruitful, and relational is sin. Anything outside of God's umbrella of marriage relationship, it's sin. But it's so much easier to say, I really don't like their sin. And here's the thing, that definition I just gave, we all find ourselves to be sinners there. None of us can stand on our own righteousness, even when it comes to this sexual purity. We all have business to do with God and with each other. But it's a lot easier to focus on what I don't like about somebody else. And so today, we get the opportunity to come to the communion table, and I thought it was just such a beautiful opportunity, because here's the problem with me wanting to judge others, whether it be my family members or those people out there that really sin. I need the grace of Jesus today, tomorrow, the next day, and it's only found at the cross. And when I go to the cross, I'm going to encounter you as well.